This panel was recorded Friday, March 19th during the 2021 Public Administration Research Conference held at UCF, Center for Public and Nonprofit Management, within the School of Public Administration. This panel is titled Human Security and Human Dignity During Crises, Pandemics, Disasters, and Wars. It is moderated by Dr. Jungwon Yao.
Good morning, all, and thank you very much for joining this panel this morning. And I hope that you've been enjoying this conference so far. I'm Jungwon Yao, Assistant Professor in the School of Public Administration at UCF. I am the moderator of this panel titled Human Security and Human Dignity During Crisis, Pandemic, Disasters, and Wars. As the title indicates, the presentations include research on issues affected by COVID-19, humanitarian crisis, and natural crisis around the world. And these are all timely and important topics. I hope that you will find this panel informative and valuable. And we have 4 presentations in this panel. And given the time limit, we'll listen for all 4 presentations first, and we'll take questions and we'll discuss from the topic from there. And each presenter will have 10 to 13 minutes. And when it's about 10 minutes since the start, I will use the raise hand function to notice and warn the presenters. So when you see the sign, I'm raising hand, then you prepare to wrap up, you be ready to wrap up your presentation. And it's about 13 minutes, and I will need to stop the presentation in order to manage the session, okay? So please be mindful of the time. And audiences may use the chat function to leave questions. Then our facilitator will assist to bring them back during the discussion session. And then we'll also use raise hand function during the discussion session if you have any questions during the time. And then meanwhile, please mute your mic unless you're presenting. So we do not have any feedback from each of you, but the presenters. So, okay, then the first presentation is on pandemic and refugee issues in India and Bangladesh, presented by Mr. Vishnu Muraleedharan. So, Vishnu, please go ahead and share your screen and start your presentation.
All right, so thank you, Youngwon. So it's nice to see you all again, at least virtually, right? So you can see my screen, right? So, all right, good morning. My name is Vishnu Muraleedharan. I'm finally a PhD student in Kaunas University of Technology in Lithuania. So today I'm presenting my research together with my supervisor, Professor Thomas Breyer from the University of Central Florida, on the topic COVID-19 implications on Rohingyan refugees, a comparative analysis of media framing in India and Bangladesh. First of all, I would like to make a short introduction about why this topic and why media and why refugees. So we all know that media is one of the main actors in the society which facilitates socio-cultural awareness in the modern times, especially because it not only creates the public, also it enables to make policy frameworks like to influence the policy measures at the governmental level. So mainly these measures have been facilitated by the media using the mechanisms of framing by agenda setting, because they have a targeted audience like who have a specific taste and interest towards a particular paper. So with that thing, they try to create the public perception, attract this set of audience and try to facilitate policy decision making. And when we look at the aspect of framing, framing is one of the most significant aspects used by the media, because using the framing mechanism, they are trying to highlight a specific part of an issue. Maybe it has been neglected by the general public or by the policy actors. So they try to bring this part into the limelight, thereby trying to create public perceptions and to get the public support and to gather the popular attention. So when we look at the aspect of media, we can see that it is one of the most significant actor, because it has been termed as a fourth estate in the democratic framework, because the first 3 estates, that the legislature, executive, and judiciary, when they fail to deliver their responsibilities in an ethical and a moral manner, the fourth estate, that is the media, try to intervene into the issue, try to highlight this specific scenario and to gather popular attention in order to rectify the odds which has been created by the first 3 estates. And looking at the aspect of migration, because like we all know that migration is one of the most contested issues in the modern times, especially international migrants. And Rohingyan, why Rohingyan issue? Because like Rohingyan migrants, like especially the people, the ethnic minority of Muslim community from the state of Myanmar, who has been persecuted by the government, by the religious associations. They were forced to go in exile to the neighboring countries, where they faced some kind of like atrocities and suppression. So that is why we are looking at the aspect of why Rohingyan, like the migrants, and especially during the time of COVID pandemic, how they have been, what are the things which affects them, and how the media is trying to formulate their perceptions towards this specific issue in both India and Bangladesh. So the methodology is qualitative content analysis of two newspapers, which are the two prominent newspapers in both India and Bangladesh in English language, that is the Times of India and the New Nation from India and Bangladesh. And the time period was from March 1st, 2020 till September 30, 2020, because that was the time period. The pandemic was at its heightened stage in both these countries. And March 1 was significant because it was the time when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. And the newspaper selection criteria was based on the highest circulation English newspaper in both the countries. We can see the circulation criteria. And the keywords were Rohingyan refugees, and the extraction method was used by LexisNexis, now known as LexisUni. And the depiction of the frames for this analysis, for the study in this specific presentation, was the ability of the article, which can attribute to identify the specific frame objective the research or the researcher is exploring about the subject matter. And the aim of the research is to analyze how the Indian and Bangladeshi newspapers portray the plight of the Rohingyan refugees in their respective countries through media framing. And the object is to analyze the role of frames in the formulation of the media discourse of the plight of Rohingyan refugees during the COVID-19. And the research question, what are the role of the media framing in depicting refugee crisis in both India and Bangladesh during the COVID-19 time period? And from the outcome, we can see that frames have been visible in both these newspapers, in both the Times of India and the New Nation, which highlight the significance attributed to the major frames, but from a different point of view, because New Nation was more compassionate and passionate towards the aspect of Rohingyan refugees, whereas the Indian newspaper Times of India was almost like a mouthpiece of the propaganda framework of the government, which have a Hindutva ideology and an anti-Muslim framework. So we are looking at the five major universal frames of victim frame, threat frame, responsibility frame, administrative frame, and the return home frame. So I will explain all these frames like in each of these frames. So the victim frame, when we look at this frame, we can see that how these people or the immigrants or the refugees has been victimized in the host countries when they reach there, because these are the people who flee because of the persecution in their home countries. But when they come over to the host countries like Bangladesh or India, what are the struggles they are facing, especially during the pandemic times, and how they're trying to combat this thing, and how the media use the discourse mechanisms to highlight these things. And when we go to the aspect of threat frame, we can see that how these, like the refugees, has been treated as like an alien or an outsider who is unwanted in the specific host country. And when we look at the aspect of Rohingyan refugees, we can see that how they have been treated in both these countries as a threat, especially maybe due to some criminal activities or illegal activities. Also, how they have been feared in both these countries, because like there's some media and some, like especially in India, they have been treated that these are the people who spread the pandemic. So these are the things which we come to look at from the threat point of view. And from the responsibility frame, actually look at the aspect of how responsible, either for the creation of the problem or for the creating a solution to this problem by the actors, especially the governmental actors or the international organizations who is making these things. And with the Rohingyan issues, we can see that in the host countries, how Bangladeshi government, together with the international organization, or how Indian government with the international framework, tried to formulate a policy solution, either creating a solution or formulating a problem for the Rohingyan people in both these respective host countries. And the administrative frame, look at the aspect of the administrative mechanisms, especially the bureaucratic, the legal, the judicial mechanisms, which try to facilitate administrative support for the refugees or the immigrant community. Especially when we look at the aspect of the Rohingyan, we will see we are looking how these mechanisms of administrative
factors in both these countries trying to act as a facilitator or inhibitor for the Rohingyan refugees. So the final frame is the return home frame, and the return home frame tried to formulate measures to return back all the refugees or the immigrants or the Rohingyan refugees back to their home country, because it is the place where they really belong, because they are the people from Myanmar, because of the ethnic cleansing or because of the violence they left the country. But most of them really intended to be back over to their home place. So we are looking how the measures are taken by both the Bangladesh and India in return in making proper repatriation back to their home country, to Myanmar, whether they are giving it in a proper facilitating manner or trying to find a peaceful solution, or whether they just want to get rid of them from India and Bangladesh. So these are the frames. And the methodology, we can see that all these frames have been properly narrated in both this newspaper, and from the New Nation from Bangladesh, we can see that they were more passionate, because we can see they are more oriented towards the victim responsibility and administrative frame, whereas the return home frame also they have highlighted, but they have highlighted it in a more compassionate manner, tried to find a proper solution, thereby making them a proper repatriation. Whereas the Times of India, the Indian newspaper, is more oriented towards the threat frame, considering them as an unwanted aspect in the Indian society, trying to propagate the message of the government, without giving additional feedbacks or narratives, trying to rectify the public perception. So from these points, I can see that the New Nation is more oriented, whereas the Times of India is less oriented and passionate towards the Rohingyan issues. And now we can look at all these 5 frames and take a few examples of these frame narratives from both these newspapers. And from the victim frame, from the Indian newspaper, the Times of India, we can see that even though they highlighted these things like the coronavirus roundup, developments in India and the rest of the world, and for many, online classes still a distant dream. So here they mention the passionate approach, but they are not talking about the Indian context, because they are mentioning about somewhere else, like Bangladesh are doing good, or in some other parts, but they are not really talking about that. They are not making the discourse about the Indian context, because that's what I said. They're trying to be aligned to the governmental policy of keeping the Rohingyans away from India, because the Indian government have a stand to take immigrants and to accommodate them, to give them documentation from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from all the neighboring countries, except Muslim community. They are saying that Hindus are welcome, Christians are welcome, Sikhs are welcome. So this is a kind of exclusion, because like Rohingyans is a Muslim community. Also, they mentioned because online classes, because due to the lockdown and the COVID-19, many of the schools have been closed and online classes have been there, but like private schools doesn't have that much proper facility. And because of lack of documentation given by the government, the Rohingyan children were not able to go to the governmental schools. So then they like these things. Even here, the narrative, we can see that they say that they're so sad they are not getting, but they are not writing why the government is not rectifying their roads. So from the victim frame, the New Nation, we can see that they are more passionate, because they are saying that check spread of coronavirus in Rohingyan refugee camps. First Rohingyan man dies from COVID-19 coronavirus in Bangladesh. So from these narratives, we can see that they are more passionate. They are sad about the situation in the camps, because like Bangladesh is not economically like forward country, so they are not able to accommodate all these migrants who are coming over there, refugees who are coming over there. So they are trying to give the shelter, but like because of the constraints, the virus is spreading. So they are concerned. The media is passionate about this thing. And from the threat frame, also from the Indian context, we can see that the Indian newspaper discourse tried to highlight the aspect of the governmental stand, thereby trying to say that, okay, Rohingyan man held for foreign forging ID cards. All 18 COVID-19 deaths in Telangana linked to Tabligh Jamaat Delhi event. See, here we can see that, okay, when they make some like illegal activities, you can try to imprison them. But like here, they are forging the cards, because like when they come over there in India, they are not getting a proper accommodation. There is not a proper documentation process. Even the international humanitarian agencies are also trying to negotiate with the government of India, but they are not properly hearing for them, trying to coordinate with them. And see the perception. The media itself is highlighting the perception of the government. because there was a religious ceremony in Delhi, which was attended by the Rohingyan Muslims also, refugees also. So they are saying that these are the people who are spreading the virus in India. These are the people who should be contaminated, who should be kept away. This is the stand of the government, and the media is also trying to formulate that is the real narrative here. We can see that the Times of India is also considering the aspect of the threat frame. And when we look at the threat frame from the New Nation, we can see that even though they also mention the illegal activities, but like they are more passionate about the even consideration towards the threat frame by the statement that lockdown rules must be strictly implemented in the Rohingyan camps. They are saying that these measures should be implemented so we can keep down the contamination rate or the people who with infected. So thereby they're trying to say that giving them a proper orientation and a proper facilities and a proper like lockdown measures, these can be contaminated. So the threat frame itself is showing a positive favorable mechanism. And when we look at the third frame of the responsibility frame, we can see that again, the Times of India, the government, the Indian newspaper itself is trying to highlight. See, in India, the government shows the responsibility as not the solver to the problem of the Rohingyan Muslims, but the creator of the problem in the host country, that's India. They're not getting proper documentation, even they are not getting proper accommodation, even they are treated as a threat. And the newspaper also highlights this narrative rather than giving a rectifying narrative that, okay, these are wrong. The governmental stand is wrong, because that is the ethical aspect of a media framework. Because like when something is going wrong, the media has to highlight and rectify the odds, even if the first three states fails. That's the first thing I told in the beginning. So here it's going in not in that way. So see that even the Facebook is not ready because they want to appease the government of India, because they have that's a big client here, because the government can go against the Facebook. Even the BJP's, the ruling parties, legislators are putting anti-Muslim posts like the Muslims are traitors, they should be shot, they have to raise the most down. And they're also putting communal violent posts by the legislators. So these are showing that the responsibility frame is also not proper in the Times of India. Whereas the New Nation, the responsibility frame is somewhat passionate, because like the government of Bangladesh is trying to formulate some solutions for the Rohingyan issues, because like it's a Muslim country, first of all, and they have a brotherhood feeling towards the Rohingyan Muslims, especially it's a neighboring region from Rakhine they are coming. And so they are trying to coordinate with the international organizations, International Migration Division, that is the UNHCR, and also trying to make like agreements and try to settle down with Myanmar, trying to get the assistance from the United States, from India, from China, trying to negotiate and to make it to a table to discuss about the future prospects of Rohingyan refugees. This can be seen from the frames like the UNHCR cost for lasting solution for the Rohingyans. And owing to Myanmar's arrogance and our weakness, Rohingyan repatriation is still a far cry. So, manner of media discourse, thereby trying to support the mechanism, they are trying to rectify that odd also. Mechanisms like the judicial mechanism or the bureaucratic mechanism are providing, if they are providing something to the Rohingyans, and if it is narrated, if it is discussed in the media, it is because of the fear that these are the people who spread the virus, so somehow we have to inject them, we have to vaccinate them so that it will contain down, and by the same time it won't spread to the Indian population. See, here we can see that the ministry itself is asking the MARSAC participants.
We need to move on to the second presentation. So Vishnu, can you stop sharing your screen? And then if you have more time at the end of the session, I'll give you more time to present the rest of the part. But for now, we need to move on. So second presentation talks about the food security issues during the pandemic, and it is presented by Dr. Claire Knox. And now, Dr. Knox, you have 13 minutes. Please be mindful of the time. Thank you.
Of course, yes. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So good morning. My name is Dr. Claire Connolly Knox. I'm an associate professor and the director of the Master of Emergency and Crisis Management program here at the School of Public Administration. I am co-presenting today with Rebecca Entris, who is a doctoral student in our school, And we are presenting on behalf of Dr. Lauren Clay, an associate professor at DeYoungville College in New York. Our presentation is entitled Disruptions to At-Risk Household Food Access During COVID-19, Implications for Supply Chain Management. And this research is funded by the National Science Foundation. Last week, we passed the 1-year mark on the COVID-19 pandemic in the U.S. The pandemic and ensuing response efforts have disproportionately impacted minority and socially vulnerable populations, which has surfaced social inequities and systemic racism issues. Specific to this case study are the disproportionate impacts to Hispanics and Latinos, as well as Blacks and African Americans in the state of New York. These populations represent higher rates of deaths and hospitalizations due to COVID-19 compared to other populations. In the U.S., food insecurity is a pressing social concern, which primarily involves insufficient funds to access foods. However, during disasters, food supply chain disruptions exacerbate challenges for the public to access food. Studies conducted prior to the pandemic indicate that socially vulnerable populations experience higher rates of food insecurity, including racial minorities, older adults, individuals with illness, and low-income households. COVID-19 has directly impacted the food supply chain from farm to table throughout the U.S. and abroad. Within the first few weeks of the pandemic, food supply chains were disrupted. There were changes in the supply of food on the shelves and demand for food by consumers. For example, farmers were oversupplied because of diminished demands from restaurants, hotels, and schools, and they discarded excess food they were unable to sell. Issues with the supply chain is not new. However, in the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season, it exposed systematic supply chain issues, especially in the southeastern United States and Puerto Rico, which impacted the ability for communities to obtain essential resources. In response, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, created 7 community lifelines listed on this page, and those lifelines do 3 things: reframe incident information, 2, understand and communicate incident impacts using plain language, and 3, promotes unity of effort across the whole community to prioritize efforts to stabilize the lifelines during an incident response. As you see on this slide, whole community includes individuals and families, including those with access and functional needs. It was included in the 4th edition of the National Response Framework, and these lifelines highlight fundamental community resources and services which, when disrupted, need to be stabilized to diminish the threats of life and property. Since their development, jurisdictions across the United States have applied the lifelines to disasters, including Hurricanes Michael and Florence and the Alaskan earthquake in 2018, and Hurricane Dorian in 2019. For this study, we focused on the food, water, and shelter lifelines. It should be noted that COVID-19 is the first test of these 7 lifelines to a pandemic. Now I will return the presentation over to Rebecca. Oh, Rebecca, you're muted.
Thanks. Based on early reports highlighting higher levels of food insecurities among socially vulnerable populations during the pandemic, this case study focuses on the lifeline food, water, and shelter during the early phases of COVID-19 among 3 risk groups: essential workers, households at higher risk for COVID-19, and racial and ethnic minorities. Although Food, Water, and Shelter Community Lifeline aims to continue operation of the supply chain for such services on the organizational level, this case study examines the impacts on the individual level. Food, water, and shelter interruptions at this level would highlight failures to provide services on the organizational level and ultimately indicate adjustments needed to the community lifelines. Next slide, please. A quota-based sample of New York State residents, excluding the New York City metropolitan area, were recruited to participate in a web-based survey administered by Qualtrics. New York City was excluded as the context and COVID-19 impact in the city was fundamentally different from that of the rest of the state. Surveys were completed between May 14th and June 20th during the stay-at-home orders in New York State through the New York State on Pause plan, which took place March 22nd through June 13th, 2020. Quotas were set to oversample individuals at greater risk of COVID-19 impacts, including 50% Hispanic, 50% Black or African American, and 50% low income or low education. Because race and ethnicity are not mutually exclusive, there was significant overlap among respondents who were both Black and African American or Hispanic. Next slide, please. The survey asked participants about food source and access issues, food purchasing behaviors, social determinants of health, perception of COVID-19 response, direct COVID-19 impacts, and individual and household characteristics. To determine food access challenges, the survey asked households how often they experience the following scenarios and were provided a list of 7 food access issues, including affordability, quantity, quality, delivery, food pantry, school food, and community meals. To determine worries about food during the pandemic, the survey asked how worried they were about their household's food needs based on 6 security issues, including cost, safety, food assistance programs, affordability, supplies in stores, and stocks at home. To determine high-risk households, the survey asked whether any member of the household was at high risk for complications due to COVID-19 because of older age or medical condition. To determine race and ethnic minority status, the survey asked individuals to indicate all races that they identified from a list of 13 race groups. To determine ethnicity, the survey asked whether the individuals identified as Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin. And then finally, to determine whether the individual was an essential worker, the survey asked whether they were required to work outside of the home during the stay-at-home orders. Next slide. The majority of individuals in the samples were between the ages of 18 and 24, female, and employed full-time as a salaried employee. There was variation in the sample in terms of education level, where most individuals sampled had either a high school diploma or a GED, some college, or a bachelor's degree. Most of the sample was Hispanic or Black. And the sample was representative of vulnerable populations, where 41% of respondents reported living in a household at risk for COVID-19, 36% reported being an essential worker, and 36% reported making under $25,000 annually. Next slide, please.
This figure presents responses to questions regarding food challenges during COVID-19. And these results show that food security was impacted. More than half of the respondents reported that during the pandemic, they could not find as much food as they wanted to buy, or could not find the quality of food their household prefers to eat. Although food supply issues seem to be problematic for the entire sample, these were more pronounced among households at risk for COVID-19, essential workers, and minorities. These 3 groups reported instances of not being able to get food through a school program, a food pantry or soup kitchen, and a community meals program at much higher rates when compared to the entire sample. As we see in the last column, food insecurity was most concerning for minorities. These initial findings suggest that food supply issues during the pandemic disproportionately affected vulnerable populations, especially minorities, households at high risk for COVID-19, and essential workers. As the U.S. implements FEMA's community lifelines at all levels of government during this pandemic, the research team finds initial evidence of increased food supply and access issues among socially vulnerable populations. Specifically, nearly 100 days after the impact to the food supply chain, this exploratory case study shows an increase impact to socially vulnerable populations in the state of New York. This raises concerns about the disconnect between organizational and individual levels of the food, water, and shelter lifeline, as well as the community lifeline's goal for a whole community approach. Future research is warranted to measure the 7 lifelines' effectiveness at the individual level, especially among these socially vulnerable populations. The larger case study will explore the research questions provided on the screen. We will triangulate findings using multiple sources of data to better assess food access issues between the organizational and individual levels. These additional data sources include situation and after action reports from New York local and state offices of emergency management, Twitter data from New York officials, and social vulnerability index information from the survey respondents. Thank you again for the opportunity to present our research today, and we look forward to any questions or feedback.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. And third, we are bringing research on how nonprofits are collaborating to address humanitarian crisis issue in military conflict zone in Ukraine, presented by Ms. Olga Pysmenna. Olga, please share your screen and then start your presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Today, I'm going to present part of my dissertation because currently I'm on the stage of the data collection. So I'm briefly going to talk about how I collect data and which barriers I have in it. And my presentation will be divided into 3 sections, mainly the introduction part. So I will introduce the problem. I will discuss the significance of the study. Very briefly, I will give you the context of the study, mainly the description of the military conflict zone in Ukraine, because not everyone is very familiar what's going on here, and the research questions. The second portion of the presentation will relate to the literature review and theoretical perspective. So I will focus on how the theories I selected for my dissertation help to shape the conceptual framework of the study. And the last part will relate to the methodology and the data collection process. So to start with, United Nations in 2014 recognized the military conflict in Ukraine as a humanitarian crisis. So why humanitarian crisis? So first of all, the military environment in Ukraine, the military conflict brought a lot of losses in human lives, a lot of economical and financial losses, and the environment created by the military operations in the eastern part of the country, they were unpredictable, and many diverse social groups were impacted by the conflict, and a lot of people needed assistance with the fulfillment of their basic needs and services. And as a result, one organization, and especially the government, were not able to react very quickly, effectively, and to protect its own citizens. So because too many people were affected and impacted, and the diverse range of services was needed to respond to the conflict. And as a result, Ukrainian nonprofit organizations needed to collaborate to help as many people as possible. The third aspect I would like to talk about is the collaborative. So because there are too many nonprofit organizations involved, the previous studies showed that the network approach is needed to respond effectively to the crisis. So, but not all networks manage to collaborate effectively. That's as a result, we need to take into account the collaborative capacity of a network. So the collaborative capacity of a network helps to increase the probability of the goal achievement and to serve as many people as possible. And the lack of collaboration among network members, it might lead to serious consequences, mainly the human and economic losses. And the aim of the study is to examine the collaborative capacity. First of all, to conceptualize the collaborative capacity of a network, to examine what factors contribute to the collaborative capacity of a network in the military environment, and how network structure impacts the collaborative capacity, and how the collaborative capacity impacts the overall effectiveness of the network. Talking about the significance of the study, first of all, Ukrainian case gives a unique military context, because the conflict started in 2014 and it's still going on. So the conflict still the conflict was not solved. So, and the military conflict, it's quite different from the disaster context, because the previous study that explored the collaboration, that focused on the network collaboration, they focused on the different types of disasters. So military conflict is slightly different from the disasters, because first of all, human losses are 40% higher comparing to disasters. Second, the study uses diverse theoretical perspective. First of all, the study uses network theory, resource dependency theory, and complex adaptive system theory. The study also utilized the mixed method approach, so it's combination of quantitative and qualitative stages. So the dissertation will include content analysis, logistic regression, social network analysis, and semi-structured interviews. And the last, why it's important, why should we care about it? Because there are still military conflicts going on in the world, so it's important to study the capacity, first of all, of a network, how to respond more effectively to this kind of conflicts, and also capacity of nonprofit organizations, so how they can contribute to the service delivery in this kind of situations. Very briefly, to show you what's the military conflict zone, where does it locate in Ukraine, so you can see the map of Ukraine. And the red part, it's eastern part of the country, it's the military conflict zone, which is occupied by separatist movements since 2014. So the gray part, it's the territory of the country that is controlled by the Ukrainian government. And the black part, it's the occupied peninsula by the Russian. So talking about the consequences of the military conflict for the country, first of all, 13,000 people were killed, 13,000 were killed, 30,000 were injured, and 1.5 million citizens were internally displaced. So they had to leave the military conflict zone and start their lives in the other parts of the country. So, and why I focus on the nonprofit sector in the country? First of all, Ukrainian government was very slow in the response to the conflict. So they had no experience, no financial or human resources. And due to the protests in the country, the government was changed. So at that time, the Ukrainian nonprofit sector activated, and it showed very high self-organization. A lot of people went to volunteer. And most of the nonprofits at that time in the country changed their activity from their previous activity to they focused on the service delivery to the military conflict zone. And they started to deliver very wide range of services. For example, they provided medical and psychological help to soldiers, to people who were impacted by the conflict, mostly to children. They also took some responsibilities that are traditional state responsibilities, for example, training of the military, purchase of the military equipment, different services that support soldiers. And they also helped civilians, so they delivered to the military conflict zone different necessary resources as food, clothes, transportation, evacuation, and so on. So there are several research questions that are going to be covered. So I started with the general broad one that will be covered by the literature review. So what is the role of the collaborative capacity of a network in building effective inter-organizational networks? The second question will be what characteristics do inter-organizational networks facilitate or hinder effective collaboration in response to a humanitarian crisis? The third question is related to the network structure of collaborative networks during the humanitarian crisis. And the fourth question is how do environmental and organizational factors impact the collaborative capacity of a network during the humanitarian crisis? Based on the literature review, I defined in my dissertation the collaborative capacity of a network as an ability of a network actors or the nodes to partner with each other within a network, and they seek collaborative solutions to respond to the changed circumstance in a fast, effective, and efficient manner. And the difference is that network capacity is larger than the sum of the capacities of each actor. So the model of the collaborative capacities consists based on the literature, there are several factors that contribute to the development of the collaborative capacity of a network. So first of all, it's organizational learning that includes the ability to be flexible and to adapt to the constantly changing, in my context, it's constantly changing military environment. So second, it's like the network structure, which includes centralization, centrality, and density. The third factor focuses on the resources, mainly human, financial, and information. And the fourth, it's inter-organizational relationships. So the relationships the network actors have between each other. So they include communication, trust, shared values, and the nature of ties between them. Talking about the theories that will be utilized, that are utilized to frame the dissertation, it's like network theory. First of all, the main focus of the theory is relationships between the actors. The second theory, it's resource dependency theory, and the primary focus of this theory is actions and behaviors of organizations based on the resources that are available. And the third theory is complex adaptive system theory, because network is perceived as the system with various actors. So here I wanted to portray how each theory shapes the certain part of a network. So like, for example, structure, it's like network theory, process, it's research dependency theory and complex adaptive system theory, and the outcomes of the network will be analyzed with the help of the network theory. Talking about the current stage, I'm in the process of data collection. I'm collecting quantitative data by sending the survey and calling to the nonprofit organizations in Ukraine. And currently, I'm also running the content analysis based on the United Nations reports that covered the activities of the nonprofit sector in Ukraine from 2014 to 2016, which covers the most active phase of the military conflict. And the last stage of the dissertation will be collection of the qualitative data based on the results of the quantitative part and the network analysis. So I'm running out of time, so thank you so much for listening and for your attention.
You actually had two more minutes because I raised my hand for.
Okay.
Yeah.
I said that
3 minutes, no warning. So if you want to go, yeah, you can use. You have 2 more minutes.
I actually covered the main points.
All right, then we'll come back during the discussion session.
Yeah, thank you.
So, yeah. All right, our last presentation, but not the least, is emphasizing the differences in hurricane recovery between U.S. states and its territories, focusing on comparing the cases of Florida and Puerto Rico, presented by Sara Belligoni. Sara,
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see it. Okay, sounds great. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and Dr. Io for moderating this. So I'm going to present my one of the chapters of my dissertation. And actually, it focuses on the recovery path between the Florida Panhandle after Hurricane Michael that hit in 2018 and Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria that hit in 2017. So this research, as I said, is part of my dissertation, and I'm a political scientist as a background. So I combine traditional approaches of political science with public administration, and more specifically, emergency management. So let's start with my research question. So I want to investigate at what extent institutions that govern the relationship between the federal government of the United States and federal and territories affect the emergency management operations in states compared to territories. Now, my political science background pretty much motivated this research because I found out that the emergency management in the U.S. works pretty much the same for states and territories, meaning that there are no different provisions or procedures for states or for territories. So the same kind of structure and system is the same. It's applied to both. But I question the fact that territories have different political status than states, and so I reasoned about the fact that in the case of when a disaster strikes, the president of the United States have to declare the disaster declarations itself, and so my question was, okay, but does it work for territories whose citizens do not vote for the presidential election? So what happens there? And then the second factor was, okay, we do have the disaster funds. So we have individual assistance, we have public assistance that is disbursed by the U.S. Congress. But the territories do not have voting representative at the U.S. Congress, and mostly they only have one representative, and the number of representatives of territories at the U.S. Congress do not depend by the population. And so even here, what's happened, because we see a lot of emergency management related issues that depend by the will of the president, by the will of the Congress, but this different political status makes the territories somehow different than states. And so I wanted to investigate it further. And so my theoretical framework, we kind of want to call it that this way, it's that we have different procedural arrangements in emergency management, and they can produce different outcomes, especially in the recovery phase in territories compared to states. And this is a result as the political status that prevents territories in entering the electoral competition, and also that is also reflected in the fact that even though the U.S. Congress is the one to which is demanded to oblige certain funds and then disburse them to local, so states and local authorities, the territories do not have a representative that can vote at the U.S. Congress. And so I'm going to, explain these differences in the procedural arrangements by looking at the electoral competition and the representation. And in terms of my hypothesis that I'm going to test, I expect that the federal assistance is disbursed quicker in states than in territories. And then the difference between the obliged and disbursed funds over time, by looking at after 2 years from the disaster, is going to be higher for territories than for states. And ultimately, I expect states to receive more disaster declarations than territories. Now, how I'm going to test my hypothesis? I'm going to use a case study comparison for for testing this hypothesis, and I'm going to look at Florida and Puerto Rico, as I said. The reason why I'm using Florida, and specifically the Florida Panhandle, it's because we do find a more similar socioeconomic status in the Florida Panhandle and Puerto Rico rather than, for instance, Puerto Rico and other states of the United States. And also because I wanted to find two disasters that occurred pretty much at the same time or so, for also, let's say, controlling for differences in the emergency management. For instance, if I would be using the case of Hurricane Katrina, that would be in 2005, and several things changed since 2005 with until 2017, where Maria hit Puerto Rico, and that's why I decided to use Michael and Maria. I'm going to use spatial analysis and quantitative analysis to test my hypothesis. So I'm collecting data for producing maps via the geographic information system that can show patterns of correlation between Florida and Puerto Rico in terms of the disbursement of the federal aid, and also the quantitative analysis is going to support this correlation that is shown in a visual way with the GIS. Very quickly, these are my data sources and my variables. So I have, I want to see if there is like a variation in the disbursement of public assistance between states and territories. I'm going to look at the ratio between the obliged and disbursed funds, and I'm going to control for the socioeconomic status and the damage of the hurricane. Even though we are talking about two major hurricanes, and I want to still control for the damage, and specifically, I'm going to look at the days without power and the magnitude expressed through an index which combines rainfall and wind gust. And the unit of analysis is the local level, so municipalities in Puerto Rico and counties in Florida. This, of course, has some limitations because the administrative structures is different, but it's also important to take into consideration that there is a difference when it comes to the emergency management procedures. In terms of preliminary findings, here you have the number of disaster declarations between 2005 and 2020 in Florida and Puerto Rico. There is a higher number of disaster declaration issued for Florida. However, the next step of this analysis is to look at the percentage, meaning how many disasters have occurred, and how many disaster declarations have been issued, because I think that gives a better idea of the reality. And interesting here is to look at more specifically the public assistance fund. So, little background: I completed my data gathering. However, due to COVID-19, several emergency management offices were super busy with COVID-19. So, getting the data for Florida took a little bit longer. So that's the reason why I'm still literally producing the maps via GIS. So far I have those for Puerto Rico because it's a study that I started about a year ago. And but I was looking at the Excel files with all my data, and I could see that the ratio between between obliged and disbursed funds between Florida and Puerto Rico was higher for Puerto Rico in a time frame of after 2 years from the disaster. And here we can see that the size of the cake is pretty much the amount of the obliged funds, so the one that are approved by the Congress. And you would see in green and red the difference between disbursed and still to be disbursed. It's interesting to see how after 2 years there are still funds that needs to be disbursed, but it's even more interested here looking at the size of the cake, which is only the disbursed amount, and you see even within case that the disbursement of the federal aid looks like to be higher in its amount for municipalities in Puerto Rico that have a higher socioeconomic index, which is in green, and then progressively yellow, orange, and red. So that's very interesting even for the within case. So what's next? So first off, as I said, I wanted to look at that percentage between disasters occur and disasters declaration, but also I want to look a little bit more in depth to the depth of Puerto Rico for that specific comparative studies and whether that influenced the disbursement of the aid, because there's literature discussing the fact that the Congress took a little bit longer to decide whether to oblige certain amounts of funds and then disburse them because of the financial status of the island. But the Stafford Act that pretty much defines the recovery and the disbursement of the aid post-disaster actually does not take into consideration the depths of states or territories. So I want to look a little bit further into this issue, and I also want to understand better how the emergency management plans from the federal local take into consideration the local level. So are those emergency management plans in terms of like operational capabilities really tailored to the local capacities? And that's really important for territories which might have like different administrations, different financial capacities, etc. And last, I also want to focus on the role of IMID, which is perfect, thank you. Which is somehow the Emergency Management Office of Puerto Rico, and I want to look a little bit more into that and how it's structuring, because it knew like a strong restructuring after Maria. And I also want to figure it out whether if it's enough, because in the case of Florida, we have the Florida Emergency Management, but we do also have the counties emergency management offices, which is something we do not have, at least in the case of Puerto Rico, meaning that during the hurricane response, the most was done by the mayors of the municipalities, which took the role of emergency managers. So that's really important to see, like how even the different administration structure can influence the way in which the whole emergency management can work. With that, I conclude, and I welcome all your questions or comments at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you all presenters and bringing this so important and timely topics. And then now we're going to take questions from the audience, and then Calvert is going to facilitate the discussion and Q&A session. So while we're waiting, I have several questions to you, each of you presenters, and then the first one is to Vishnu. Can you hear me now? You need to unmute your mic.
Sorry. Okay, I can hear you now, right?
All right. So you selected 2 newspaper outlets for your data, right? And yes, those are the ones that circulates the most. But then I don't think the circulation doesn't necessarily mean that it's not biased. So do you consider using any other sources like other newspapers or the government report and other stuff to validate your idea or triangulate your findings?
Now, actually, I try to select the newspaper based on the higher circulation, because like we have to get some newspapers which have the popular the outreach, and also like you said, which can't be biased and can be biased. But I don't know any methodology like to select that thing in India and in Bangladesh. But like when I did my article on Parkland, I can select, because like there is a slant quotient ratio, which we can try to measure the political allegiance of the newspapers in the United States. But I cannot find something like that over there in India and Bangladesh. So the only popular option was to get the newspapers which have a maximum outreach and which I can try to analyze, because like that can be in English, right? Because like I don't know Hindi, the national language back in India, and I don't know Bangla back in Bangladesh. So that was the only option which which was accessible for me to make a comparative analysis of the media narratives in both India and Bangladesh.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And second, about the same, similar, questions on methodology. So Dr. Knox and Rebecca, how did you identify your samples? Because you have like 400 over samples, but then, compared to the size of population in New York I wonder whether it's really representative sample or not. So can you explain more about your sampling procedure?
So honestly, the best person to answer that would be Dr. Lauren Clay, who is the keeper of said data. And but it was, and Rebecca, come in if you can answer better than I can. But my understanding was that it was a random, through Qualtrics, it was a random sample, but she specified the to over survey those particular at-risk portions of the population to make sure that we do grab that information. They were able to clean the data with individuals who either selected all A's or all B's, as well as those who completed the survey too quickly, to try to make sure that the respondents that we used in our analysis were, those responses were as valid as possible.
Anything you'd like to add, Rebecca?
Nope, I think that Dr. Knox covered it all. Just another note on that too is then, as we mentioned briefly in the study, that there are, I think it was 9 counties excluded because they were either in New York City or right around the metro area. So making sure that we have data that's consistent around the state.
Very good. And then my question, and then thank you so much for the response. And my next question is to Ms. Olga Pysmenna. And I know that you are now collecting your data, and then you haven't done the analysis, analyze the data yet, but do you have any initial findings? It doesn't have to be like structured findings, but an observable or perceivable, like your understanding. And then can you briefly share if there is any?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. For now, initially I identified 150 organizations, and unfortunately now they're very busy with the COVID issues, but I managed already to collect 22 responses. And for now I can see, I had an preliminary assumption that they collaborated mostly with the big organizations, but now I can see, and it really something different from my perceptions and expectations. They collaborated mostly with the small organizations. So this is for now the main finding that I have, only from the responses I got, because I started to do a lot of phone calls, and they talk and they want to discuss a little bit to go beyond the survey. And I said that if you will be selected, you can participate also in the interview. They're very excited because they want to tell their stories, how they contributed to the service delivery. It's a little bit different from my dissertation topic, but for now I can see that they collaborated with the small ones. So it's quite interesting. I'm looking forward to analyze more, when I will get more responses, to see other factors that impacted their collaborative capacity.
All right, my last question to Ms. Sara Belligoni. And what do you think is a major hindrance that makes such difference between United States and then United States territories?
Yeah, in terms of emergency management, if we look at these 2 cases, I think that the main issue preventing to have the same procedural arrangements was the capacity of advocacy on one hand, but also the local structure, so the local capacities and how administratively territories, and specifically the case of Puerto Rico, is. So we have, again, in Puerto Rico, we have 78 municipalities. Not all of them have emergency management offices that can somehow, implement the federal emergency management plans. They do not have the capacity, either financially speaking, or in terms of like the number of personnel. So like implementing, what it's suggested by the federal government, it's sometimes very difficult at the local level. And that's one of the reasons why one of the shortcomings of this research is to understand whether creating an emergency management office for the territory of Puerto Rico is enough, or it's necessary also to kind of like have like some sort of like counties, let's say, in Puerto Rico. So like offices that can cover, 5, 6, 7 municipalities and have stronger like capacity financially in terms of personnel to implement these plans. And as I said, advocacy, it's also a big issue, because when you don't have, representation from where you are supposed to get the help, might prevent also getting the help itself. And so I think those are the two main reasons why we have seen different procedural arrangements, and, how they reflect in the, specific case of the public assistance funds that I analyzed for my study.
All right, thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Calvert to facilitate the main discussion session, and then any audiences can participate. And if you have any questions, please use raise hand function, and then you can directly, identify the presenters that you want to ask questions. All right?
Yes, I have a question myself to Dr. Knox. I saw from your research, which I found very interesting, that a big factor that you guys analyzed was race and ethnicity, and how that affects the way in which families and households are affected by COVID. And my question is, why did you, I don't want to say favor, but why did you use that factor more than, let's say, socioeconomic class or status? Why do you think race and ethnicity was more important in this specific research than economic class?
So great question. Part of that goes into the previous literature, and we focused our energies to specifically on food insecurity issues, because this, again, is a pressing concern regardless of whether there's a disaster or not. And that's where Dr. Clay's research is so unique, is that she is an expert on food insecurity during disasters. And so based on previous literature, we looked at what were those different groups of individuals who were more susceptible to food insecurity during the sunny day, non-disaster times, and then we applied that to a disaster situation. But we did include those earning less than $25,000 a year annually. So we did include some of the social economic status components. But what we noticed is that when we analyzed the data, being a minority was more of especially of Black, African American, or Hispanic, Latino descent, were more impacted by the supply chain disruptions during COVID-19. So that's a very, very good question.
Thank you. If anyone else has a question, they can either type it up in the chat and I can read it out loud for you, or they can raise their hand and ask it.
If I could, going back to Sara. So first of all, everyone, amazing research. And I love how we are looking at these issues from different countries, different research methodologies, different theories. So I loved this session. So thank you. But for Sara, I think you're onto something, tying back to what Dr. Yo mentioned and asked you about regarding the differences in the states versus the territories. And, you mentioned Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and yes, a lot has changed. But what's unique, I think, a unique component is that what we saw in Katrina is a lot of what we're seeing in Puerto Rico, which was the local governments were not prepared. And every disaster starts local, every disaster ends local. And so I think you're spot on when it comes to thinking through what are those future steps that Puerto Rico should be taking, and decentralizing that emergency management functions through all phases down to that local level is so essential. And I think that's the biggest shift we've seen here in the United States from Katrina to present. It's still not perfect, especially when that whole community ideal that we've still yet to reach. But I think that it'll be. I'm so looking forward to your research and seeing, what are those disconnects that are happening. So very good research.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, and absolutely, you're right. Like the decentralization is something that it has occurred where in the past we have those kind of issues, and it's fun because like this morning in the other panel I attended, we were talking about that and how it's something that is occurring not only in the United States but in other countries, and we were discussing the case of Italy, for instance. So it looks like that the decentralization and giving to local authorities and local communities more capacity in like preparing and responding and recovering is essential. So it's definitely like a shortcoming to look at. So thank you so much for mentioning that.
I'll keep going with the other research. So, Olga, I thought your research was really, really interesting, especially looking at the impacts of looking at the nonprofits. That is such a huge component to that network approach regardless of what is facing a community. And so I love that you are looking into this in this unique context. So kudos, because I know that's not easy. It's a lot of hard work.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's very interesting because, like, first of all, I had some issues with translation, first of all, because in Ukrainian language, first of all, in Ukraine, there are two languages, Russian and Ukrainian. So I translated survey into both languages, Russian and Ukrainian. And in the language, because collaborative capacity is not existing in the language, so I was forwarding the survey to translator back and forth. Then I pilot tested the survey and asking, I had two organizations where I pilot tested the survey. So if they understand what I'm trying to ask them. So it's very interesting, like how different in general, like the language approach to this. So from one hand, I'm very excited about this and to see how different, like, first of all, I'm excited to get my findings, like to see what I will be able to find to collect data while I'll be done with the data collection. But the second, how different we are. So the context really matters. And that's very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. And if I may, to Barcay, is pronouncing your name correctly?
Sorry, can you repeat? I cannot hear you.
To our first presenter.
Vishnu.
Yes. I'm sorry?
Vishnu.
Yes. Yeah. So, with Olga talking about language and how you phrase things or word things is really important. So, with your different frames, what's your big conclusion? So what is the takeaway based on the research that you've done?
All right. So I tried to look at this research from, like, you see that there are 5 frames. Like, I was trying to look at both these newspapers from 5 frames and how this media discourse is formulating in both these countries. So we can see that my final conclusion is that the media frames or the discourse by the New Nation, by the Bangladeshi newspaper, is more pro migration oriented. Like, they are more passionate, more compassionate, and they are more ready to highlight the voices of the migrants. And also, if there is some rectification needed from the government, they are ready to give that in the statements, in the body of the text, in the news media, like narratives. But when it comes to the Indian newspaper, even though that is the biggest national newspaper with the highest circulation, even though till now no political allegiance can be found, even though there was no methodological standpoint in India to measure this thing like in the United States, because like in the States we have that mechanisms. So, but like all these frames, when I look at all these frames, they are trying to be part with the governmental stand of supporting the idea of anti-Muslim frame, because like the Rohingyans ultimately is a Muslim ethnic community from Myanmar. So the government of India's stand is to support all the other religion from the neighboring countries except the Muslims. So the media is also narrating the discourse in such a way. It was a shocking thing for me, because like I never experienced this thing back in India till 2014. Till that time, it was the Congress government. That means like the more like the liberal government was there, but now it's more towards a Hindutva, like the national religious government, which and this media is also going aligning. It's not only the Times. If you look at all the Indian newspapers and all the news channels, some way or other they are trying to be part with the government, because otherwise they are coming under the censorship by the government, try to cut them, try to put them in control. Or so this is the big conclusion, that this is the discourse is more pro migrant oriented in Bangladesh, whereas it is anti, or to be an extent non-migrant or refugee oriented in India. So that is the conclusion, and this is a paper which we are developing. So I hope that by next month we have to make it final thing.
Well, very interesting and so important. So thank you for the space to be able to talk to each of the other presenters, because again, this research is so important. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have another question for Sara. So Sara, what do you think, what do you make of the role of corruption and mismanagement of funds during the Rosselló administration during the Hurricane Maria?
Yeah, actually, this is part of like one of the things I want to look at related to the debt and the financial situation in Puerto Rico, and how it eventually affect or just like prevented, the island to recover as much as other places. So the thing is this. The corruption that you might see in Puerto Rico, and all the discussion there have been after the hurricane regarding the Rosselló administration definitely could have played a role. Now, those are not part of the focus of my research, but as I said, like the financial crisis itself, if you look at why we do have a financial crisis in Puerto Rico, which is still ongoing, you have to take into consideration both the political status, and so trade limitations and tax limitation, etc., that can kind of like put together responsibilities from the local and federal, and at the same time also the corruption issues. So I think that once I will get to the step of investigating this aspect, the corruption and the financial issues that relate to the local government, that will come into play. Right now I don't have like a specific or accurate answer, because I didn't look into that. So I focus more on the public assistance funds from the federal government awarded, and then how they will be, or they have been used already at the local level is not like a part of like a focus of what I'm looking at the moment. But that's a good like point to look at later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if I could add, I think Kelbert's question points to the reality that as we built the structure for the conference with the tracks, right, the safety and security, community and society, sustainability and resilience, and then the governance and stability piece. This track we put under the safety and security because of the unstable environment created and the need to stabilize and get back to normal, right? But I think the question he just asked is that all of these research topics, whether it was Vishnu's discussion of the media or the point that Kelber just made, really ties into this problem set can be looked at from many angles. And it really just depends on how you frame it in small, subtle ways. And so it was a great question, but the framing of this panel is really, really insightful. And, just tweaking things in a slight way can add such great value. So I appreciate the question. And I'm really excited about how this panel turned out. You guys shared great papers, and the questions have been so wonderful.
Again, dark silence. So I have to ask a question. Again, I have a pressure as a moderator. So Vishnu, can you share more? Can you talk more about your findings, especially possible potential connections to the national religion to their the impact of the religion to their framing of refugees?
So you're asking about the government and their allegiance to the religious aspects. This is the question, right?
Yeah. Because for my understanding, I don't know. I'm not sure whether I have a correct understanding or not. But then, for my understanding, Bangladesh is a Muslim country.
It's a Muslim country, right?
Yeah, and India is like diverse, but then majority is Hindi, right?
Yeah.
But then if the migrants are from like Muslim background countries, then the religion plays a lot. I think it is, especially if the religion is supported by the national government or in general of the population. So
actually, like you said, Bangladesh is a Muslim country. India is a democratic country. We don't have a national religion, right? So it comes with diversity. Like in the United States, it's come with the diversity. We call India unity in diversity because of the lot of religious ethnicities, minorities, like the languages, more than 20 or 25 official languages, including English. So it's like it comes every state, every religion, every region is different. My costumes and my dressing, my food habits, and my religious aspirations is different from my neighboring state. So it's like a complex thing. It's like we call it's like a European Union because every country have their own every state have a language. So every state in India have their own language to an extent. So, but till 2014, it was the liberal government. We call it the United Progressive Alliance by the Congress government. So they were heading the national government. So it was very fine till that time. Everything was fine. Any refugee comes, even the Rohingyan refugees till that time who are coming to India, they were greeted amicably, very cordially, and they were given the proper documentation for their stay in India. But this government called the National Democratic Alliance, it is headed by the Hindutva party called BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party. So they came to power. So they changed everything drastically. It's like how Trump came to power in the United States, right? So everything was changed. So the Narendra Modi, the prime minister was Modi. He was the best friend at that time to Trump. He was very sad when Trump went out of office. So like they were like brothers, like two sides of a coin, right? So they have this radical there. It was white supremacy, but in India it was Hindu supremacy. The dominating religion, even though we don't call religion as our life. But when they came, they make every narratives on the basis of the religion. They call everything on the basis of the religion. They even reframe the constitution and they change the national citizenship right. And they try to change everything on the basis of the religious affiliation. So till that time, we are taking people from the neighboring countries who have difficulties, like who are somehow suffered, maybe violence or war or something. But after he came to power, he said, no, from the neighboring countries, people are welcome, except Muslims, right? Because we don't want you here. Somehow we are trying to get rid of who are here, right? So that is the narrative they are trying to formulate. And like I said, the media, till that time, whenever there's some kind of issues, either religious, ethnic, or whatever, they try to frame the news both in the text and in the body in such a strong language. But after they came to power, the narratives became very feeble because the censorship was too strong with the government because the government controls every mechanism. So that is the thing. So now India is only taking from the neighboring countries who are not Muslims. So that was the background which I tried to make a narrative between India and Bangladesh. Even though Bangladesh is Muslim country, but they are not Rohingyan Muslim country, right? So Rohingyan is like an ethnic Muslim community in Myanmar, in the Rakhine state. But like they are friendly. Not only Bangladesh, Malaysia is friendly, Indonesia is friendly, or some other Asian countries are friendly when they are going there. But when it comes to India, the story changed. So that is the reason why I tried to put this narrative. Yeah.
Vishnu, you mentioned the refugee status. What was the driver of that refugee context, right? Was it war? Was it famine? Was it water resources? Was it natural resources? Was it a natural disaster, hurricane? What was the driver of that refugee push that basically cascaded into this political turmoil, right?
All right. Okay. So like because my primary research is regarding the migrant crisis in the United States, the sanctuary movement started in the 90s when there was like the violence and war in the Latin America. Like in India, the neighboring countries, it was somehow like some countries it is with the natural resources, like Afghanistan, because there is the war and the scarcity of the resources. Like in Sri Lanka, it was in the 2000 because of the fight between the local population, that is the Sinhala population, who are primarily predominantly Buddhist, and with the immigrant population from the southern part of India called the Tamil. So there became a clash, and then the ethnic cleansing happened. So the Tamil started coming to India, back to their home. Or the Afghanistan people are coming because of the war. Pakistan, because of the religious persecution by the Muslim majority or in Pakistan, the Hindu population, because like it's Pakistan, because we have a like a thinking that okay, Pakistan is majority Muslim, but there are Hindu and Sikh communities there. So because like they have to either get converted or get to be killed in Pakistan. So these they come from Pakistan because of war, from Afghanistan because of war, because from Sri Lanka because of ethnic cleansing. So these are the communities who are coming. But now they are coming, but now there is a screening process, whether you are Muslim or not Muslim, right? So India changed. And I hope that one day, like in America, the change will happen in India also, right?
All right. Seems like we only have 1 minute left. So is there any other last question for this session?
I do have one last question for Vishnu.
Sure.
And it's a very brief question.
Mm-hmm.
I remember you mentioned briefly Myanmar.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, has there been a recent flow of immigration from Myanmar given the very recent coup? And what has been the response from the Indian government and the Indian community towards the Burmese or the people from the refugees from Myanmar?
All right. The main outflow was during the 2014 because the third wave of clash happened between the Rohingyan, like the Rohingyans, and also with the local Buddhist population. But after that, during the COVID time, this flow again started. But like Bangladesh is still accepting because it's because it's like a bordering area. But when it comes to India, somehow they came over here to India, but the government is not friendly and cordial, because like they are saying that. Like what I already narrated, because like they don't want, and they are not ready to give a proper documentation like a register, so that somehow they can get the help of the UNHCR, right? If you're registered in this country, in a country where you're coming, you can get the assistance from the United Nations, like the Human Rights Commission, like from the Amnesty International. But when the government fails or deliberately attempts not to give the document, they were forced to have in a vulnerable situation.
All right, time's up, and then we have the next schedule. So if you have more questions, you can stay here and continue discussion, but then we have to move forward for the whole conference. So thank you very much for joining this panel, and then I hope you continue this research and then get published, and then make more make it more valuable to the public and all that. Thank you very much, and you have a good day.
Thank you, and same to you, right?
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Good day.
Good day. Bye.